All right, buckle up, everyone, because we're diving deep into some pretty major shakeups in UK immigration. We're talking about a whole wave of changes that hit in 2024.
Yeah, big changes.
And we've got a whole stack of sources to untangle it all. We've got some research papers from the UK Parliament, insights from NHS employers, a Home Office fact sheet, and
And a
yeah,
YouTube video summary.
exactly, a YouTube video trying to break it all down. So our goal today is to figure out, what do these changes actually mean for folks, especially if you've ever thought about making the UK your home.
One thing that really stands out is just how quickly these changes came into effect.
Yeah.
And they're impacting, well, pretty much every visa category you can think of.
It's kind of mind-blowing. I mean, did you know the income you need to sponsor a spouse went up by over 50%?
It's wild.
And in some cases, care workers can't even bring their families with them anymore.
Huge impact.
Yeah, so we've got a lot to unpack today.
We do. So the groundwork for all these changes is this thing called the 5-point plan. It was introduced by James Cleverly, the Home Secretary at the time, back in late 2023. And it was really designed to tackle this record-high net migration, which hit like a whopping 866,000 people in 2023.
That's a massive number of people.
It is. It's estimated that these changes could actually block around 300,000 people who would have been eligible to immigrate under the old rules.
So that's a pretty big chunk of people.
It is.
And what's interesting is, even though it was the Conservatives who came up with this plan, the Labor government that took over in July 2024, they mostly kept it going.
They did.
So it seems like there's some agreement, across party lines on this issue.
Definitely. It's one of those rare areas of consensus.
Yeah. So to really grasp what these changes mean, I think we need to zoom in on how they affect specific visa categories, right?
We do.
Why don't we start with the health and care visa? I know that one saw some of the most drastic changes.
It did.
What's the situation for care workers now?
Okay, so one of the biggest changes is that care workers and senior care workers who are coming to the UK on this visa, they can no longer bring their dependents. And by dependents, we mean like spouses, children, that kind of thing.
So that's a big one right there.
It is. It's a big deal. But it's important to note, this only applies to new arrivals. So existing care workers who already have families in the UK, they're protected.
Okay, so at least there's some protection for those who are already there.
Right.
But for anyone just starting to think about a move, that's a huge factor. And I know the salary requirements also went up, right?
They did. So for those who are on national pay scales, the minimum salary to even qualify for the visa is now £23,200.
Okay.
And that's up from £20,960.
So a noticeable jump.
Yeah, it is. And for other care worker roles, they need to meet a general salary threshold of £29,000.
So even higher for some.
Right. And then there's another layer of complexity. Now, only providers who are registered with the Care Quality Commission, the CQC in England, they're the only ones who can sponsor these visas.
So it's like they're making it tougher to qualify on multiple fronts. It seems like they're really trying to limit the number of care workers coming in. What about the skilled worker visa?
Yeah, so that one also saw a pretty dramatic increase in the general salary threshold. It jumped to £38,700.
Whoa, that's almost a 50% increase.
It is. So you can imagine that makes it a lot harder for many skilled workers to qualify.
I bet. That must price out a lot of people who might have been considering the UK. Are there any, exceptions to this new threshold?
There are a few. So anyone who was already on a skilled worker visa before April 4, 2024, they're exempt from this new threshold, at least until 2030. There are also lower thresholds for people under 26, recent graduates, NHS staff, and those working in education.
Okay, so some wiggle room there.
Right. But they did replace the shortage occupation list with this new thing, the immigration salary list. It's basically stricter, which means fewer jobs will qualify for that lower salary threshold.
So kind of a mixed bag. Some good news for those already here, but tougher for newcomers.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, let's move on to family visas. I know those got hit pretty hard as well.
Yeah, so the minimum income you need to sponsor a spouse or partner, that jumped to £29,000.
Hold on, that's like a 55% increase. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, initially, the Conservatives were actually planning to raise it even further to £38,700.
Seriously?
Yeah, but thankfully, the Labor government put that on hold for now.
Okay, at least there's a pause on that.
Right. They're having the Migration Advisory Committee take a look and review it.
So there's a chance that huge jump won't happen.
Right. But even that 55% increase is still a lot.
It is. Does that apply to everyone or just new applicants?
Thankfully, it's only for first-time applicants. If you already have a family visa, you're good. And it is worth mentioning, you can use savings to meet that income threshold, but you're going to need a hefty sum.
Interesting. So there's some flexibility there, but it still shows how much harder it's become to bring your family to the UK. With all these changes, it makes you wonder, did Parliament even get a say in this? Was there any pushback?
This is where things get a little complicated. None of these changes actually went through a formal vote in Parliament. They were implemented automatically through these things called statements of changes to the immigration rules.
Wait, so they just sidestepped Parliament entirely? How is that even possible?
Well, it's a bit of a technicality. Essentially, these statements of changes let the government tweak the immigration rules without needing a full parliamentary vote.
So they basically have a lot of leeway to make changes without much scrutiny.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
There were some debates, but they weren't binding, so there wasn't much power to actually stop these changes once they were announced.
So what was the reasoning behind all of this? What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, both the Conservatives and Labor, they were concerned about the record levels of immigration, especially the increase in student dependents, care workers and their families, and those coming in on humanitarian visas.
So it sounds like they were mainly trying to reduce those overall numbers.
Right. There was also this desire to, protect the UK job market and encourage businesses to rely more on British workers.
I see. So it's about controlling immigration, but also about putting British workers first. I can see how that raises some questions about, how welcoming the UK really is to people from other countries.
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure. But it is important to note that even with this focus on reducing overall immigration, the government still recognizes the value of international workers in certain fields, like healthcare.
Right, because they still need doctors, nurses, roles that are often tough to fill.
Exactly.
So it's a balancing act.
It is.
What about the graduate visa? That's the 2-year work permit for people who graduate from UK universities. Right.
Did that one see any changes?
It definitely came under review, especially with worries about potential abuse.
Makes sense.
But in the end, no major changes were made to the graduate visa itself. However, the government did introduce measures to regulate recruitment of international students, trying to prevent fraud and ensure that they're genuinely coming to study.
So they're keeping a close eye on things, but no major overhaul yet. Okay, we've covered a lot here. Let's take a minute to recap for our listeners what we've learned so far.
Sure. So we've seen some of the most significant changes to UK immigration in recent memory. The government implemented this 5-point plan in 2024 aimed at reducing net migration.
Right. And those changes have made it harder for many people to move to the UK. They've impacted a whole range of visa categories.
They have.
And we've also seen how these changes are playing out against the backdrop of the UK's political landscape.
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting.
And because, we can't ignore the political side of things. Immigration has definitely become a hot-button issue in the UK. Absolutely. It's a topic that's sparking debate all over the place. And it's not just the UK either. It feels like we're seeing this trend in lots of Western countries where there's this growing push to, tighten immigration controls.
Yeah, and often it's driven by, anxieties about the economy, about cultural change, and we hear those anxieties reflected in the language politicians use from both the Conservative and Labour parties. Like they talk about protecting British jobs, making sure immigrants are self-sufficient, things like that.
Right. And those goals, they sound reasonable on the surface, but they also raise some important questions like, what does self-sufficient even mean in this context? And are we overlooking all the ways immigrants actually contribute to the UK's economy and society as a whole?
It feels like we're oversimplifying a really complicated issue. And we also can't forget about the human side of things.
Absolutely. We're talking about real people whose lives are being turned upside down, families are being separated, individuals are being denied opportunities, and there's this sense of uncertainty and anxiety that hangs over immigrant communities.
It's honestly heartbreaking to think about. We need to remember that many immigrants are incredibly skilled, motivated people who could bring so much to the UK.
You're right, and we shouldn't underestimate the ripple effects of these changes. Like, take the care worker situation. If it suddenly becomes way harder for care workers to come to the UK, it could make the existing staffing crisis in the social care sector even worse.
It's a really good point. And what about the impact on UPRE universities? If fewer international students can afford to study there because of these tougher visa rules, that could seriously hurt their funding and global reputation, right?
Definitely. International students bring so much more than just tuition fees. They bring new perspectives, contribute to research and innovation, and often they stay and become valuable members of the UK workforce.
It's a good reminder that immigration isn't just about numbers, it's about people and the unique contributions they make. When we create barriers to immigration, we risk cutting ourselves off from a wealth of talent and diversity.
I couldn't agree more. And it's worth remembering that the UK has this long, rich history of immigration. It's a nation that's been shaped by waves of people coming from all over the world.
That's so true. It's part of what makes the UK so unique and vibrant. And throughout history, immigrants have been essential in building the UK's economy, culture, and society.
Absolutely. And we need to keep that historical context in mind when we're debating immigration policy today. It's about finding a balance between managing immigration effectively and acknowledging all the benefits it can bring.
Finding that balance is key. And it needs thoughtful discussion and debate, not just slogans and fear-mongering.
I agree. It's important for all of us as informed citizens to engage in these conversations and advocate for policies that are both fair and practical.
We need to challenge misinformation and stereotypes, and remember that immigrants are not a monolithic group.
Absolutely. Each person has their own unique story, their own skills and aspirations. We need an immigration system that recognizes and values that diversity.
Well said. Okay, so we've talked about the broader context of these immigration changes. Let's circle back to some specifics. One thing that really struck me was that dramatic increase in the income threshold for sponsoring a spouse or partner.
Yeah, that was a huge change, and it raises some serious questions about fairness and accessibility.
Exactly. It essentially creates a financial barrier to family reunification. For many couples, that £29,000 threshold is just not attainable.
It is a lot of money, especially when you consider that many people in the UK don't even earn that much themselves.
It's almost like saying love and commitment are only valid if you have a certain income level. It makes you wonder who gets to decide what a real family is.
It is a troubling implication. It seems to contradict the idea of supporting families. How can you support families while making it harder for them to be together?
It's baffling. This whole thing highlights how important transparency and accountability are when making these decisions.
I completely agree. We need to understand the reasoning behind these policies and if they're actually achieving what they set out to do. And the people most affected by these changes need a voice in this discussion.
Their experiences are crucial for understanding the real-world effects of these policies and finding solutions that are both practical and humane. And it's important to acknowledge the emotional weight these changes have on families.
Yes, absolutely. The stress and uncertainty of navigating the immigration system can be enormous. Add in financial barriers and bureaucratic hurdles, and it becomes completely overwhelming.
It reminds us that we need to approach immigration policy with empathy and compassion.
And with a strong sense of fairness and justice. After all, we're talking about people's basic rights to family life and the pursuit of a better future.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered the human impact, the political context, some of the specific changes. Now, I'm curious about your thoughts on what this all means for the UK's future.
That's the big question, isn't it? I think it's safe to say the UK is at a crossroads when it comes to immigration.
It definitely feels like a pivotal moment. The choices made now will have lasting consequences.
They absolutely will. The UK has a choice to make. Does it embrace its history as a diverse and welcoming nation, or does it retreat into a more insular and restrictive stance?
That's a powerful way to put it. It's a question each of us needs to grapple with.
We do. We all have a part to play in shaping the UK's future, and we need to decide what kind of society we want to live in.
One that values diversity and inclusion, or one that prioritizes exclusion and homogeneity.
It's a stark choice. I truly hope that, as a nation, we choose the path that leads to a more just and equitable future.
Me too. A future where everyone, regardless of background, has the chance to succeed and contribute to the UK's success.
That's a vision worth working towards. And I believe it's achievable if we work together and make our voices heard.
I agree. So, in this deep dive, we've looked at the details of the UK's immigration changes, the political and social context, and the potential consequences down the road.
And throughout all of this, we've had you, our listener, in mind. We hope this conversation has been informative and thought-provoking.
Absolutely. We want to empower you to engage in these crucial conversations and make informed decisions about the issues that matter most.
Your voice matters, and together we can create a more welcoming and inclusive world.
Beautifully put. Okay, before we move on, I want to go back to a particular visa category we haven't discussed in much detail. The graduate visa.
Yes, the graduate visa. That's an interesting one, especially considering all the other changes we've talked about.
Right. On one hand, it seems like the UK still wants to attract and keep those highly skilled graduates from overseas.
It does. It's like they recognize the value those grads can bring to the UK's economy and workforce.
But then, on the other hand, there's been some scrutiny of the graduate visa. Some are worried about potential abuse and what it means for overall net migration figures.
True. And as we mentioned earlier, the government has already taken steps to regulate how international students are recruited, partly in response to those concerns.
So it seems like the graduate visa is kind of walking a tightrope.
It is trying to balance attracting global talent with the political pressure to lower immigration.
It'll be interesting to see how that balance evolves in the coming years.
Absolutely. Will the graduate visa remain a viable option for international graduates who want to build their careers in the UK?
Or will it face more restrictions and scrutiny?
Only time will tell. But for now, it's still an important pathway for those thinking about studying in the UK.
It is. It's also a reminder that the UK's immigration system is in constant flux.
It's definitely a dynamic system shaped by a mix of political, economic, and social factors.
And it's up to us, as informed citizens, to stay engaged and make our voices heard.
Well said. The choices we make today will impact the UK's future for generations to come.
So let's choose wisely, and let's continue these important conversations about immigration, diversity, and the kind of society we want to create.
I'm with you on that. I'm excited to see what the future holds for the UK and for all of us who call it home.
Me too. All right, when we come back, we'll look at some of the specific challenges and opportunities these immigration changes present for individuals and families.
Sounds good. Looking forward to continuing this deep dive with you, our listener.
Okay, so we've covered the big picture of these immigration changes, but let's get down to brass tacks. What does it all mean for you, the listener, especially if you're thinking about a move to the UK or already have a life there?
This is where it gets real. We're talking about how these changes actually affect people's lives, their chances of building a future in the UK.
Exactly. So let's imagine you're a skilled worker from overseas. You're qualified, eager to contribute. What are some of the roadblocks you might hit now?
Well, that huge salary requirement for the skilled worker visa, that £38,700, that's a major hurdle for a lot of people. Even if you have the skills, finding an employer who'll pay that much, especially when you're starting out, it can be a real struggle.
It almost feels like they're saying, sure, come to the UK, but only if you're already earning a ton of money.
It does send that message, doesn't it?
Not exactly rolling out the welcome mat.
Yeah. And even if you do find that employer, that job that meets the salary, the application process itself, it can be really daunting. The paperwork, the fees, the waiting, it can be emotionally draining.
I can imagine. And for families trying to move together, it's even harder. That higher income requirement for sponsoring a spouse, that's a whole other level of stress.
Absolutely. Imagine you're in love, you want to build a life in the UK, and then you realize you can't be together because of this income rule.
It's got to be heartbreaking.
It is. It forces families into impossible choices, stay apart or give up on the UK. And we can't forget about those who are already in the UK on visas. All this uncertainty, it's unsettling.
It's got to be really tough. It makes you wonder, is this sustainable? Can the UK really afford to turn away skilled workers and families when so many sectors are short-staffed?
It's a valid question. It does seem a bit counterproductive, doesn't it?
It does. It feels like we need a more balanced approach to immigration, one that looks at the needs of the entire UK.
I think you're right. We need a system that balances control with compassion, one that recognizes the value of all workers, whether they're skilled or unskilled, and one that understands how important it is for families to stay together.
Right. A system that's fair, flexible, and that adapts to the changing needs of the UK. So for our listeners who are trying to make sense of all this, where can they go for information and support?
The UK government website, gov.uk, is a good place to start.
Yeah.
It's got all the official info on immigration rules and visa applications.
Right, but those government websites, they can be a bit overwhelming sometimes, can't they?
They can be. Luckily, there are other organizations out there that provide really good guidance and support to immigrants and their families. Groups like the Migrants' Rights Network and the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants.
Those sound helpful. What about people who want to get involved in actually shaping immigration policy? What can they do?
One of the most impactful things you could do is contact your local MP, your member of parliament. Let them know your concerns, your perspective.
Right. It's easy to feel powerless when these big policy changes happen, but we can make a difference.
We can. And if you're passionate about a specific issue, you can also join advocacy groups, campaigns that share your views. There are lots of organizations fighting for fair immigration policies.
So even in the face of these changes, there's still hope. there's still a chance to make a difference.
Absolutely. And that's what we want to leave our listeners with today. This is a complex issue, but there's room for growth, for connection, for finding solutions. It's about remembering that immigration is about people, about families wanting a better life. So approach this topic with curiosity, with empathy. Keep an open mind and stay engaged, because the more we understand each other, the better we'll be at creating a future where everyone feels welcome and valued. Until next time, keep diving deep.